As we were looking at the speeches of Emma Goldman and the writings of Emma Goldman, many of which were written in the 19-teens, we kind of figured out that if you just covered the dates for some of these, that the words that she spoke, whether she was speaking about politics, whether she was speaking on behalf of the working class, whether she was speaking about love and marriage, were extraordinarily resonant today as well. So we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to look at her life and to look at her legacy. You'll be hearing her words tonight, and you'll also be hearing from writers, journalists, and politicians and historians as to how her work affects their work today. We're going to start with an actress, Eva Amesse. She works at the Tenement Museum, who will be reading some of the works of Emma Goldman. We will then be joined by historian Ty Jones, who will give us some background on Emma Goldman and her historical context. And then we'll be hearing from historian Lara Vapnek and hopefully writer Vivian Gornick and council member Rosie Mendez. I'm going to just do brief bios of everyone now, and then we'll jump right into the program. Ty Jones got his PhD from Columbia University in history and is currently the curator for history at Columbia University Libraries, so he's loyal to his alma mater. His latest work, his latest book, is More Powerful Than Dynamite: Radicals, Plutocrats, Progressives, and New York's Year of Anarchy. So you can understand why we would want him here to contextualize Emma Goldman. Vivian Gornick is the author of, among many books, the acclaimed memoir Fierce Attachments and 3 essay collections, The End of the Novel of Love, Approaching Eye Level, The Men in My Life, and Emma Goldman, Revolution as a Way of Life, a short biography that came out with Yale University Press in 2011. Rosie Mendez is the city council member of District 2. She represents the Lower East Side, the East Village, Gramercy Park, Rose Hill, Kips Bay, and the southern part of Murray Hill. She's a lawyer. She's worked on behalf of tenants, and every day she kind of trods the same ground that Emma Goldman walked on, arguing and fighting for the rights of her constituents, much like Emma Goldman earlier fought for the rights of New Yorkers. Lara Vapnek is a historian specializing in the history of gender and labor in the 19th and 20th century. Her first book, on sale at the Tenement Museum, is Breadwinners, Working Women and Economic Independence. And her second book, which will be coming out soon, is a short biography of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And Lara is a good friend of the Tenement Museum. Some of you might have been here last fall when she spoke about Flynn as part of a program we did on Union Square. So now, please join me in welcoming Eva Amesse in the role of Emma Goldman. She'll be reading excerpts of a speech called Marriage and Love from 2014, a century ago.
Marriage and love have nothing in common. They are as far apart as the poles. They are, in fact, antagonistic to each other. No doubt, some marriages have been the result of love, not, however, because love could assert itself only in marriage. Much rather, it is because few people can completely outgrow a convention. There are today large numbers of men and women to whom marriage is not but a farce, but who submit to it for the sake of public opinion. At any rate, while it is true that some marriages are based on love, and while it is equally true that in some cases love continues in married life, I maintain that it does so regardless of marriage and not because of it. Marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, an insurance pact. It differs from the ordinary life insurance agreement only in that it is more binding, more exacting. Its returns are insignificantly small compared with the investments. In taking out an insurance policy, one pays for it in dollars and cents, always at liberty to discontinue payments. If, however, a woman's premium is a husband, she pays for it with her name, her privacy, her self-respect, her very life, until death doth part. Moreover, The marriage insurance condemns her to lifelong dependency, to complete uselessness, individual as well as social. Man, too, pays his toll, but his sphere is wider. Marriage does not limit him as much as woman. He feels his chains more in an economic sense. In our present pygmy state, love is indeed a stranger to most people. Misunderstood and shunned, it rarely takes root, or if it does, it soon withers and dies. Its delicate fiber cannot endure the stress and strain of the daily grind. Its soul is too complex to adjust itself to the slimy woof of our social fabric. It weeps and moans and suffers with those who have need of it, yet lack the capacity to rise to love's summit. Someday, men and women will rise. They will reach the mountain peak. They will meet big and strong and free, ready to receive, to partake, and to bask in the golden rays of love. What fancy, what imagination, what poetic genius can foresee even approximately the potentialities of such a force in the life of men and women? If the world is ever to give birth to true companionship and oneness, not marriage, but love will be the parent.
Good evening. It is a pleasure and an honor to be back here at the Tenement Museum, New York City's most exciting historical institution. And I'd like to thank Annie for setting up this event. I'm here tonight to give a little historical context and then to get out of the way as our distinguished panelists talked about how Emma Goldman's work has affected their lives. But I think that the fact that we can discuss Emma Goldman's legacy this evening in so many different ways is a wonderful testament to the extraordinary variety of her interests and activities. She speaks to us in numerous contexts, and her memory can be invoked for any number of causes. And here you can see the variety of lecture topics that she could. An anarchist, a feminist, a revolutionary, an accessory to violence, a labor organizer, a political theorist, a psychologist, an anthropologist, a sexologist, an enthusiast of modern theater and art, a provocateur, a publisher, and an advocate of birth control. She was a hostess of memorable dinner parties. She was an enthusiastic bohemian. At the Red Revels that scandalized New York, she was famous for performing the Merry Widow waltz on roller skates. Newspapers frequently called her the Queen of the Anarchists, and Nellie Bly, the famous investigative journalist, dubbed her the modern Joan of Arc. In an era when it was rare and quite shocking for a woman to even approach the civic sphere, Emma Goldman was a public intellectual and a celebrity in the center of the public eye for more than 2 decades. In that time, she traveled the country constantly, often for months at a time, and personally addressed audiences in enormous numbers. There's no way to know how many people actually attended all of Mrs. Goldman's lectures, but her manager calculated that in one 3-year period, he had handed out 500,000 playbills for her events, and the number is certainly in the millions. Her speeches and her monthly journal, Mother Earth, which she published from 1906 to 1917, were her primary forms of communication, and we should remember that these were cutting-edge communication technologies for their time, traveling by railroad around the country and publishing a journal of art and literature. The advanced views that she preached led one journalist to describe her as between 7,000 and 8,000 years ahead of her time. Emma Goldman spoke often in these tours on her political beliefs as an anarchist. And anarchism in this instance is not a mere synonym for chaos. It is a historical global movement. Opponents of governmental power Anarchists advocated a type of socialism based on individual autonomy and democratic decision-making. Of all the many philosophies that emerged from the Enlightenment, anarchist to its adherents was the purest and most hopeful. Humanity was perfectible, each could prosper, all were worthy of trust, self-government was government enough. In a society of equals, there would be no need for any authority other than one's own conscience. The uses of government, policing, jailing, war-making would all be unnecessary after the end of capitalism. But as radical as this idea was and its implications, none of this reveals exactly why J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Bureau of Investigation, considered Emma Goldman to be one of the most dangerous anarchists in America. And to understand that, you have to put her in the historical context of the anarchist movement. From 1880 until 1920, self-professed anarchists carried out or attempted to carry out several very high-profile assassinations and bombing attempts. Their few successes were interspersed with many more failed plots, suspected conspiracies, provocateur agents of the police, so that in these years, some radical outrage was more or less a daily feature of life. Emma Goldman's life itself very neatly parallels the years of the anarchist heyday. Born around the time when anarchism became a discrete political movement, she died in 1940 after the Spanish Civil War ended. And she was directly or indirectly involved with many of the most important events in anarchist history. Even as a girl in Russia in the 1880s, she had been aware of the existence of violence. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by an anarchist bomb, and you can see the young Emma standing with her family in the picture above. Soon after she came to the United States, she read about the Haymarket tragedy in Chicago when a bomb thrown into a squad of police officers led the city to arrest and try the city's leading anarchists, several of whom were then executed. This martyrdom, as Emma Goldman would have called it, of these anarchists was a formative experience for her and convinced her to commit herself entirely to the cause. A few years later, in 1892, Emma Goldman helped her lover and lifelong comrade Alexander Berkman to plan an assassination of steel magnate Henry Clay Frick, who was Carnegie's right-hand man in Homestead. This was during the middle of a violent strike. In 1901, President William McKinley, the President of the United States, was assassinated by a young man, Leon Chodorow, who had known Emma Goldman, had attended several of her lectures, and had tried to join her movement. She had rebuffed him and had not been involved at all in this crime, but for the newspapers, this was the moment that really transformed her into a national notorious figure. So if you look at these names in 1901, here is a survey of political figures or popular cultural figures, and this gives you some sense of just how she ranked in terms of the celebrity or notoriety of this moment. You can see that more than 2 stories a day were published about Emma Goldman around the country. This was the year that Queen Victoria died, in case you're wondering why there's so much about Queen Victoria. Then in 1908, an anarchist in Union Square tried to throw a bomb into a group of police officers. The bomb exploded prematurely and killed the young bomb thrower. Emma Goldman was in Milwaukee at the time, but police nevertheless tried to implicate her in this crime. And so again and again, she would be the first person that authorities would investigate whenever anything like this happened. In 1914, 100 years ago, Emma Goldman again was out of town, but Alexander Berkman masterminded a plot to try to assassinate John D. Rockefeller. but 3 anarchists were then killed in this tenement house on Lexington Avenue. Although Goldman privately complained about the irresponsibility of building bombs like this in a crowded tenement, she publicly mourned the dead anarchists as martyrs to the cause. So I don't want to overemphasize the violence here. What's important is that while media focused on these deeds, anarchism was a global movement claiming hundreds of thousands of adherents. They founded schools, organized cooperative societies, worked with labor unions, argued equitably for a post-capitalist society. Only a tiny handful of these people ever resorted to violence, but the acts that did occur with the very sensationalist press of the time really turned anarchism itself into a synonym for violence, a synonym for chaos, a reputation that I think it has to this day. Emma Goldman herself never personally committed an act like this, but she was almost certainly in planning sessions where people talked about it, and she always said in her writing that there was a place for self-defense in political actions. In 1917, after the United States entered World War I, Emma Goldman was arrested for speaking publicly against the draft and spent 2 years in prison. And in 1919, she and Alexander Berkman and several hundred other Russian radicals were deported to Russia aboard the ship, the SS Buford, which the press called the Soviet Ark. The years 1917 to 1919 marked another high point in her notoriety. In 1919, she was cited in more than a story per day, making her, without a doubt, one of the most prominent newsmakers of that year. You can also see, especially the growth of Karl Marx's references here, the fact that the Soviet Union has brought Marx and Marxism very much into the story like it was not in 1901. When Emma Goldman left the United States in 1919, the mass media lost one of its favorite subjects. But far more important, the nation had just expelled perhaps its most stirring and inspirational voice. For 2 decades, she had been the conscience of the country, rebuking possessors of wealth and power, speaking for those without influence, and serving as a moral leader for reformers and revolutionaries alike. The loss to America of her influence in the 1920s and 1930s cannot be measured. These years were another turning point. The rise of the Soviet Union spelled the end of the age of anarchism. Almost overnight, the term Red Menace, which for decades had applied to the anarchists, suddenly applied to the communists. And you can see here the references to anarchism are in black, to communism are in red, and it's within 2 years, 1919 and 1920, the public conversation about those two factions completely reverses, and then, of course, communism becomes a far greater story, perhaps reflecting increased mass media, but it's certainly a far greater story. So Emma Goldman arrived in the Soviet Union just a few years after the revolution, but she very quickly grew critical of the Bolshevik regime. She and Alexander Berkman published condemnations of Lenin, and they became really the first ever to, among the left, among important figures of the left, to critique the Soviet Union, a controversial move to this day. By 1921, they had abandoned the Soviet Union and found themselves exiled from their country of exile. Emma Goldman would spend the next several decades in Europe and in Canada. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, she immediately traveled to Barcelona and finally there saw firsthand what a community organized along anarchist principles might look like. She dedicated herself to the Spanish Civil War cause, becoming the leader of propaganda and publicity for the Republic and living in London. And after the loss in Spain, she again resumed a life of exile. In 1940, she died in Toronto, Canada at the age of 70 years old. In that time, Goldman had been allowed one brief 90-day visa to return to the United States in 1933. Otherwise, it had been more than 2 decades since she had been here. But customs officials allowed her friends to bring her body into the country. And so Emma Goldman is buried in Chicago right next to the Haymarket Memorial, and also Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and other leading figures of American radicalism. In her lifetime, Emma Goldman was extraordinarily well-known and a highly scrutinized figure. Here we can see the fact that this attention to her activities was nearly constant. She lived in the public eye for all these years and constantly carried the weight of being the main advocate of an extremely controversial and notorious cause. After her death, you can also track her memory in the same way. This shows how many references to Emma Goldman are in published books which have been digitized. And you can see how her afterlife maps onto historical interests. You can see her fame peaking during the years of the Great Depression and the Spanish Civil War, followed by a dramatic and prolonged decline during the years of the Cold War and the great post-war dichotomy of capitalism and communism. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, Emma Goldman experienced a tremendous rebirth and revitalization as New Left activists and feminist scholars rediscovered her and used her story to inspire their own. And from then until today, Emma Goldman has been remembered as a central figure for the American and international left. Her inspiration and influence has shaped generations of activists, artists, and thinkers. And tonight, we will have the privilege to hear how. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Emma. Again, she's going to come back and read from a speech, actually from an essay called What is Anarchism, that was written in 1910.
Real wealth consists in things of utility and beauty, in things that help to create strong, beautiful bodies and surroundings inspiring to live in. But if man is doomed to wind cotton around a spool, or dig coal, or build roads for 30 years of his life, there can be no talk of wealth. What he gives to the world is only gray and hideous things, reflecting a dull and hideous existence, too weak to live, too cowardly to die. Strange to say, there are people who extol this deadening method of centralized production as the proudest achievement of our age. They fail utterly to realize that if we are to continue in machine subserviency, our slavery is more complete than was our bondage to the king. They do not want to know that centralization is not only the death knell of liberty, but also of health and beauty, of art and science, all these being impossible in a clock-like, mechanical atmosphere. Anarchism cannot but repudiate such a method of production. Its goal is the freest possible expression of all the latent powers of the individual. A perfect personality is only possible in a state of society where man is free to choose the mode of work, the conditions of work, and the freedom to work. One to whom the making of a table, the building of a house, or the tilling of the soil is what the painting is to the artist and the discovery to the scientist, the result of inspiration, of intense longing, and deep interest in work as a creative force. That being the ideal of anarchism, its economic arrangements must consist of voluntary, productive, and distributed associations, gradually developing into free communism as the best means of production with the least human waste. Anarchism, however, also recognizes the right of the individual or numbers of individuals to arrange at all times for other forms of work in harmony with their tastes and desires. Anarchism then really stands for the liberation of the human mind from the dominion of religion, the liberation of the human body from the dominion of property, liberation from the shackles and restraint of government. Anarchism stands for a social order based on the free grouping of individuals for the purpose of producing real social wealth, in order that will guarantee to every human being free access to the earth and full enjoyment of the necessities of life according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations.
So I just want to echo Ty's thanking Annie for organizing this program and inviting me to participate, and it's really exciting to have an opportunity to think about the legacy of Emma Goldman. And Annie asked us to kind of reflect on how Goldman inspired us. And I first encountered, it made me kind of think back to how I first learned about Goldman. And it was actually through reading her biography, Living My Life. I don't know how many of you have read that book. It's still really very compelling. And I actually picked it up in preparation for tonight, and I felt like I didn't want to put it down. I just wanted to sit and read through the whole thing again. But I love the way it starts with that story of her coming to New York, finding her way around the Lower East Side, and really for the first time it seems like feeling at home. And I think that aspect of her biography really links in nicely to the Tenement Museum, to this location, but also to the idea of these different people kind of taking a journey to New York City and finding a new community to be part of. And in Goldman's case, that community that she found when she came to New York in 1889 was the Jewish anarchist community on the Lower East Side. So since that moment when I first kind of encountered Goldman through her own words, I have written and researched and taught about the history of gender and labor and social movements. And in doing that, I think there are three aspects of Goldman's legacy that I have found that are really significant. First of all, her self-creation as a public intellectual, and this really kind of echoes what Ty said about Goldman. Secondly, her analysis of women's oppression, and I think this comes through in the selections that we've heard from Goldman herself. The ways that Goldman challenged the more conventional women's movement of the time, I think, are really interesting. And then thirdly, Goldman's very expansive ideas of women's freedom. So I'm just going to touch very briefly on all three of those things. So first of all, just this idea that this immigrant who comes to New York pretty much penniless, doesn't have much formal education, reads very much as an Eastern European immigrant. She's a young woman that she makes herself into a public intellectual in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century is really kind of incredible. I mean, it's just this amazing act of self-creation. And I think the fact that then, she kind of really starts in New York, but the way she's so national in scope and then international in her vision. But all of these people come to see her talks. They read her publications. They read stories about her in the newspaper. So she just kind of turns herself into this public figure that really kind of galvanizes debate, especially about politics, about gender, about social class, the power of the state. So there are so many kind of hot button issues that she's really right at the center of. And I think her goal was really to make people think, to make them question. In that way, I would say she's more of a provocateur than an organizer. She was involved in a lot of different organizations, but it seems to me like her really significant position was being this kind of galvanizing figure that would make people really kind of question the social order. That's really what she wanted to do. The other thing that I think is interesting, just as a historian who's focused on women, is there are a lot of women in the late 19th century and early 20th century that are active in all kinds of different social movements. So Goldman is by no means unique in terms of, being concerned with what's happening in the public sphere. But what is unusual about Goldman, if almost unique, maybe not entirely, is her audacity to be an individual. So it's this period of time in which even women who came into the public sphere tended not to necessarily, they were often speaking for other people. So Goldman is really interesting because she's really speaking as herself, for other women, but she's really grounded in her own experience in a way that is kind of shockingly frank for the time that she's in. So that's kind of the first piece of it. I would say the second part for me is just her analysis of women's oppression. So she is very cognizant of the challenges that women face, especially working class women. She has no kind of romanticism that she attaches to women going out to work. I mean, she basically argues that most women who go out to work are not being emancipated. They're wage slaves, they're worse off than men because they have worse jobs, they have longer hours and lower wages. And she commented just on this inequality. She said, "Nowhere is woman treated according to the merit of her work, but rather her sex." So just this fact that kind of no matter what these working women did, they were always treated as women. And I think it was really interesting that she brought that out. Now, whereas there are a lot of other women at this time that are organized, they're organized in the labor movement or the suffrage movement, and there's this real focus on women winning the vote, right? Women win the vote nationally in 1920, and all kinds of different women participated in this campaign to win the vote. And Goldman is really sort of a contrarian in that she basically says winning the vote is a waste of time. So that, at that point, was a really radical thing for her to say. I mean, there were anti-suffragists that were conservative, who would say, well, women shouldn't vote because they belong at home and politics is for men. But Goldman basically just thought voting was not nearly radical enough to accomplish the changes that she thought needed to happen. And she just, as an anarchist, she had no faith in government. And this is the high point of the progressive era, where there's this big focus on getting people involved with politics, getting the state to remedy, problems and inequalities. And she had no faith in the state doing any of that. And so this is just another quote of hers. She said that every inch of ground men had won had been won through a constant fight, a ceaseless struggle for self-assertion, and not through suffrage. Thus she saw no reason whatever to assume that woman in her climb to emancipation has been or will be helped by the ballot. So when she was saying this, I mean, this is like the high point of the suffrage movement. This was sacrilege, And I think this is just part of what I kind of admire about Goldman, is that she's really not afraid to challenge anyone. She has this kind of rebelliousness in which she's ready to kind of poke into the pieties of basically any movement or any group. And of course, her rejection of the ballot is in keeping with her anarchist philosophy, because anarchists, saw the state as a source of oppression, not as something that was going to be good for any better for women than it was for men. But one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about her is that she saw women's emancipation as actually coming from within, and she talked about that. And in that way, it seems to me that she kind of anticipates the feminism of the 1960s and the 1970s. And so when she talks about women's oppression, it's not just external, it's internal as well. She talks about all the ways that women sort of oppress themselves, and she believes that there won't be a real change until women learn to think about themselves differently. And so that is also like a very radical idea for the late 19th or the early 20th century. The right to vote or equal civil rights may be good demands, Goldman conceded, but true emancipation begins neither at the polls nor in courts. It begins in woman's soul. So she was not afraid to state things dramatically. So I think that is very interesting to me, that kind of location of emancipation. I mean, in a way within anarchism and all of these different movements that she participated in, but also individually kind of within women themselves. Another idea that she rejected was that women were inherently more moral than men. And this was a very popular idea in the late 19th and early 20th century. And all kinds of women use this basically to justify coming into public and taking on a greater public role. I mean, you can see that, like people like Jane Addams, for example, who was involved in the settlement house movement, or settlement houses. You would see the same thing in New York, this kind of argument like, women need to come into politics because they're going to purify it, right? Men have made a mess of politics, and women need to come clean it up. She completely objected to this idea. She thought that the idea that women were claiming any kind of moral superiority was not only wrong, but it was stultifying, and it was part of the way that women were actually kind of oppressing themselves. So here's another quote from her. "Woman's greatest misfortune has been that she was looked upon as either an angel or devil. Her true salvation lies in being placed on earth, namely in being considered human." So I just think that is such a wonderful kind of statement, really about her feminism, which is about women becoming human. I mean, that was really how she saw feminism. And she described women's emancipation as a struggle to make it possible for women to be human in the truest sense. So it's really about how are women going to gain their humanity, which is just such a kind of broader question than, how are women going to win the vote? And I don't at all mean to discount, myself winning the vote. I've written quite a bit about it, and I think it was important. But I think the way that Goldman raises these broader questions is still really provocative. So she saw emancipation in terms of women breaking barriers to free self-expression. And for her, this implied not just free speech, but also a free expression of sexuality. And again, at the time, that was completely radical, that a woman would kind of speak out for women's right to free sexual expression. I mean, and she just kind of put it out there. And if you read her autobiography, again, she's very frank about her sexual experiences. She doesn't think there's anything to apologize for in terms of women wanting to have sexual experiences, to enjoy sex. And she argued for birth control in part because she thought that was necessary for women to be fully human. They needed to kind of have access to free sexual expression. And in that way, I mean, I think she really did kind of help usher in sort of a sexual revolution. And she worked with Margaret Sanger to really spread the ideas of birth control. It was one of the many things that she was arrested for. But speaking out about birth control at the time was really quite radical. And it's something that the mainstream women's movement really avoided because they really did not want to associate themselves with any kind of compromise to respectability. So it's a period when respectability is still important. And she basically just kind of tosses it aside and says, we're wasting our time on this. Like, we have more important things to think about. And of course, we also heard from the speech on marriage and love some of her critique on marriage, which is also really quite interesting. So just to kind of sum up, I think Goldman really linked the personal and the political, but she did it in kind of fresh and unexpected ways that not only anticipated later iterations of feminism, but actually posed some really interesting challenges in terms of how we think about power and social change, our ideas about ourselves that are still really provocative. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lara. I think the spirit of Emma Goldman, the legacy of Emma Goldman, is with us tonight in the words of her speeches as performed by Eva, in the wisdom of our historians, and also in the anarchic spirit of the evening. Two of our speakers are yet to arrive, which I think is good. It serves me right for trying to be too structured about the evening. And what we're going to do we're going to, talk amongst ourselves a little bit, but we really want to hear a lot from you. What is it that brought you out on a beautiful spring evening to hear about Emma Goldman? Are you here for anarchy? Mm-hmm.
What is the name of the previous?
The name of the speech?
Yeah, the speaker. She didn't
Oh, Lara Vapnek. So at the beginning, I read that. Lara Vapnek is a historian at St. John's University, a professor there, and the author of Breadwinners, and she's the author of an upcoming book on Elizabeth Gurley Flynn as well. So I just wanted to ask you, both of you teach. You've taught at Bard, you teach at St. John's, you teach at Columbia. What is it, how do you find students today reacting to her work, if at all? Oh, sorry. Exactly.
I think that most people come to Emma Goldman through a quote that we have not heard yet. I'm sure if our other two speakers were here, we would have heard it at least once. Something along the lines of, if I can't dance, I don't want to come to your revolution. And so I think that quote encapsulates what Lara was talking about, this notion of the political as personal, and also the notion of individual expression as the fundamental basis for a free society. So I think students, usually that's all that they know about her. In the past few years, really since 1999, and then especially since the Occupy movement, I think that I've seen, and I haven't been teaching since 1999, but in the past few years I've seen more interest and curiosity about anarchism as a historical movement, and you can really trace that to the end of the Soviet Union and the necessity of finding other historical traditions of protest for people to engage with. I obviously am interested in Emma Goldman primarily for her role in anarchism, so maybe that's a bias of my interest, but I've definitely seen an upswing in people's curiosity about that.
My students are totally shocked by Emma Goldman, and they almost can't believe that she's a real figure. And in part, maybe it's the way that I set it up when I introduce Emma Goldman when I'm teaching women's history, but we will be talking about the new woman, who's the college-educated woman, who's taking on new roles, women in settlement houses, women in labor unions, and then you kind of get Emma Goldman. And she's almost like a bomb that's like exploding in the middle of the whole thing. In that she's so challenging, and I think my students are really surprised by not just her advocacy of birth control, but how forthright she is about sexuality. For a woman to be so forthright about those things in the early 1900s really surprises them. Yeah.
I remember I was teaching when I was a graduate student and teaching a course, and I was creative, and I made my students give a walking tour of the Lower East Side. So everyone kind of was assigned a different spot. I think they could choose. There was some choice in it. And we were over by the Educational Alliance, which is a wonderful settlement house few blocks away. And one of the students who was not talking about the Education Alliance slipped into the bathroom. And then when the student who was talking about the Education Alliance was finished, she came out, but she came out in costume. And she came out as Emma Goldman, which is one of the reasons I thought it was so important to have our actress here tonight in costume as well. And she just proceeded to give an Emma Goldman speech, and then in Rucker Square, which was the assembly. But Rucker Square was the place where everyone gathered and would hear soapbox speakers, and it was kind of this, at any time of day, you could be hearing a speech and hearing multiple speeches, and she just got up, and that really kind of affected me, the way in which these words, as we've come to find, are still resonating with students. So much so that they will embarrass themselves in front of their classmates at a very vulnerable age. So another thing, in Vivian Gornick's book on Emma Goldman, which is a wonderful kind of short biography, she writes about how Emma Goldman felt so strongly that things need not be as they are. And that was something that kind of defined everything that she did, that the world just did not have to be as it was. And suffrage wasn't the answer to it. Marriage certainly wasn't the answer to it. But today, do you have the sense that there's anyone out there in our, whether it's any kind of public intellectual, who takes things on in the same way she did, or in a similar way?
Chomsky.
Do you want to bring them on? Okay. Should I, like, does anyone want to, or anyone want to respond?
Do you think there's
Oh, that was a question for me. I don't think that it would be possible for someone to occupy the same space that she occupied. There's so many more voices in the public discourse right now, but there certainly are plenty of people who are dedicated activists today, but they face a far more complicated economic and political system.
Yeah, I mean, I think her spirit lives on. I mean, if you think about, I was just thinking of the band Pussy Riot from Russia. I mean, they, to me, seem to be so much in Emma Goldman's spirit. But I don't know if there's kind of a singular figure like her that's occupying, the same space.
Yeah, let's take some questions from the audience, too. And just wait till the microphone comes to you, and then you'll be...
Oh, thank you. Well, I live in France, and I can tell you that what French feminists there are, and I started working with the French feminist movement in the 70s with Monique Wittig, they are completely cognizant of Emma Goldman and as located in their bodies as she is. There's a movement there called La Barbe, and these are women who put on beards and stand behind the great French men as they begin to give their public orations. And it's the most wonderful thing you've ever seen. It's a silent and beautiful criticism. And when they speak, they give satiric speeches in using the metaphors and locutions of the great French speakers. So it's just, I feel that Emma Goldman would not be displeased with that.
Yeah, especially the theatricality that they're...
Exactly. And also, Emma Goldman is more located in her body than any public figure I ever met. No one mentioned tonight that she was also a body worker. She did masseuse. She, and almost everything she says about love comes from a person who was clearly knew what it meant to be a lover. And that, you never hear that from politicians today.
Well, we hear some aspects of that roundabout way. Usually they don't want us to find out. And also, I mean, one thing that we didn't get to tonight, too, is that she was, and I might have missed this, but trained as a midwife and worked as a midwife as well, which is an extremely needed profession among the tenement districts.
I was going to say, Emma Goldman had a really shocking immigrant experience when she showed up in Rochester. And she had that bad marriage, and she worked in those and I wondered how much of that early immigrant experience, which really happened in a short period of time, like 3 years before she showed up and started, finding her community in New York. I wondered how much you thought that shaped eventually what she became.
I think Emma Goldman had many typical or maybe slightly extraordinary experiences, atypical or typical, and Vivian Gornick writes about her childhood and about her relationship with her father, but really there's nothing in her social, political, or economic life that inherently set her apart from the millions of other young Russian Jewish immigrant women coming to New York. She really was one of those very few people for whom it was impossible to live with the pain that's in the world. And it's an individual reaction that in many ways defies historical analysis. I mean, there really is no way to explain an Emma Goldman. I mean, we're here tonight to talk about her because she is so exceptional, and her reaction to conditions was so unique. Vivian writes well about this. I wish she was here.
Yeah, no, and I was just thinking about how Vivian writes about just the force of her individuality, that she had the force to stand up to her father, certainly, even her siblings, her husband, and her tradition. Like, she stood up to everything, and even Johann Most, who was one of her first teachers and lovers, he kind of sent her on a speaking thing, and she came back and she had found her own voice. Like, he had told her, given her speaking points and speeches, and at a certain point in that speaking tour, threw it away and just started speaking from her own experience as a working person, incorporating the experience of the working class that was coming to her speeches as well. And she came back and she, like, basically Johann Most was like in love with her and was so happy to see her back and brought like violets to her. And she got mad at him because she's like, "Why haven't you asked me about the speeches?" And he's like, "Oh, I heard about it. I heard you did a good job, but I want to see you. And she was so angry that he wasn't interested in hearing from her perspective, how those speeches had gone, that she just threw him. She was done with him, and she was able to kind of continuously. The force of her individuality was so strong that she could keep distancing herself. So I agree, with what you're saying, that there's nothing in her particular background necessarily, but it was that force of her individuality or psychology that made her, that was so strong.
Yeah, but I do think that those early experiences, I mean, they enabled her to speak firsthand about something that was this huge movement of immigration, of women entering the workforce, and I think people were aware of it, but there's some way in which, as the individual she was able to kind of take that and articulate what that inequality felt like and really protest against it in such an articulate way. So I think those experiences really were important. I think it was important that she really was, among workers and kind of saw what it was like every day, and just to speak again, to this issue of the body, to what it did to your body, to like work those hours at those kind of confined, repetitive jobs. And I think that it all kind of was grist for her mill. It gave her like more material to work with.
So I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about Margaret Sanger and her friendship and kind of who came first, and was one more known first, or kind of more about that.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, I don't know, Ty will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they both came to it around the same time. They both were nurses. They both worked with working class clientele. They both kind of saw the consequences of poor women having all of these unwanted pregnancies, suffering through terrible abortions, having children they couldn't afford to feed. So I think in that way they're together. They're definitely aligned, and they did work in tandem. In the early years. I mean, I think there's more of a separation later on, in that Sanger takes birth control in a different direction. She actually decides she wants to make it respectable, and so she talks more about kind of family planning. For Goldman, it's about women being able to control the number of children that they have, but it's also about women having free sexual expression. And, Goldman kind of hangs on to that radical idea, I think, after Sanger kind of tries to distance herself from it a little bit.
Right. The Emma Goldman and the anarchists more generally were huge inspirations for many people who began their careers around this time. Margaret Sanger. I think that Emma Goldman was really the formative influence on Margaret Sanger's early work. The same is true with Roger Baldwin, who founded the American Civil Liberties Union and began his work on free speech, defending anarchists and union leaders. Journalists like Walter Lippmann and Upton Sinclair were all involved in these activities before World War I. And that same narrative that Lara describes of pulling back from them defines all of those figures. And I think that we forget just how violent the repression of radicalism was in the first Red Scare of 1919 and 1920. And there was a mass disassociation with one's past. Baldwin and Sanger sought much more respectable paths for their work. Other people went underground and changed their names. Thousands of people were deported. So there's a historical element to the story of that progression. But many of these ideas we don't remember, but they actually were born out of the anarchist propagandizing before the war.
Yeah, just one more thing. At the start of it, really, birth control, it was also kind of a free speech issue in that it wasn't legal to send information about birth control through the mail or to rent a hall and talk about birth control. So birth control and free speech were very linked early on.
I have so many questions, but I'll try to ask three quick ones. One is, you mentioned the assassination of McKinley. I read the equivalent of the Warren report for the assassination of McKinley. What made Emma Goldman repulse against this anarchist? He was a handsome fellow. And the second thing, the second question is, in her autobiography, she writes about the New York City police surveillance against her. Did you guys, were you able to get those surveillance reports, use them as research, and could we look at those reports today? And I was always just fascinated in a funny way about how Yom Kippur feasts.
Oh, the Yom Kippur feasts, and I'll speak to that. So, one of the ways that anarchists in this neighborhood, when at the turn of the 20th century, this was the largest Jewish neighborhood in the world. So, although there was a lot of change, the holidays of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, were pretty observed to the point. Even to the point at which people who were the socialists, members of the Arbiter Ring, the Workmen's Circle, would go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, and the editor of the Forward even had to say, let them go, that's part of tolerance, and there was a huge debate about that. But on one of the ways that the anarchists could really express their anarchism was to have big parties on Yom Kippur. So these were called anarchist balls or Yom Kippur balls, and Emma Goldman, I think, was featured at some of those as well as much. But in some ways, it's an interesting thing. You have these parties, and they still felt the need to rebel according to the Jewish calendar, even as they had totally moved away from it, which is an interesting point.
The McKinley question is quite interesting. Emma repulsed Chodosh because Chodosh was clearly unstable, and she could tell that he was a dangerous person to associate with. What's maybe more interesting about Chodosh is that when McKinley was assassinated, he was surrounded by Secret Service agents who were protecting him. Chodosh, unfortunately for them, was a tall, blonde, and blue-eyed man who did not fall into their stereotypes of what an assassin would look like. They had seen an Italian-looking person, and so their attention went to this other person. And at that moment, Chodosh pulled the trigger, and then, in fact, he was captured by an African-American person whose part in the story was almost immediately written out. So it was a fascinating moment in racial presumptions of criminality and innocence. As to surveillance, the police were constantly surveilling the anarchists and all of the radical and labor movements in the city. The administration in 1914 to 1917 innovated wiretapping, and they had wiretapped all of these organizations, even while they were declaring themselves to be defenders of free speech, a familiar tactic till today. The provocateurs succeeded a few times in convincing young radicals to commit acts, but Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were far more sophisticated than the police informers, although there are a few stories in her biography about betrayals that really hurt her. The records do not exist for the New York Police Department. The records were tossed in the East River to save space in the archives about 50 years ago, I think. Early Bureau of Investigation records might exist, Secret Service records, but most of what we know comes from the mayor's reports in the municipal archives and memoirs and autobiographies.
I'm intrigued with how openly both Emma Goldman and Berkman kind of turned against conditions in the Soviet Union. They were very open about it, while many American radicals really were in denial well into the 1930s. Were they, I know they didn't choose, they were deported, they didn't choose to go to the Soviet Union. Were they already questioning it before they went, or they realized the situation soon after and just were really honest about it? What was going through their minds?
Did everyone hear the question? So the question was about Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman saw very quickly the problems in the Soviet Union, and what was it that gave them that insight as compared to others?
I think, my reading of it is that they left the United States with very high hopes for what they would find in the Soviet Union. And actually, when I was researching the Flynn biography, I found a letter that Goldman and Berkman had written from aboard the Buford, which was the ship that they were sent out on. And they were describing the horrific conditions on the ship and the horrific conditions of the deportation, but really kind of hoping that they were going to find this new day in Soviet Russia. So I think they went into it with very high hopes, but those hopes were pretty quickly dashed. And unlike some other radicals of their generation, they weren't willing to make excuses for the Soviets. And I think in part it was because they were anarchists, and the anarchists were targeted by the Bolsheviks, and so they had really hoped, at this kind of earlier point in the revolution, that it was going to be this kind of new freedom. But when they saw how anarchists were being treated by the time they got there in 1919, and just how little space there was for dissent in the Soviet Union, I think that really turned both of them, against the Soviet project.
Did she ever refer to a successful adequate revolution in history that worked out? I might think about it as the French Revolution, but that's somewhat doubtful. Yeah, it was there, but they had adequate before. No doubt about that.
Well, historians don't like to talk about success and failure. The Russian Revolution looked like a success for a while, and then it looked like a failure, and it could look like a success again before too long. When you think about the history of radicalism, and if you think about it in terms of absolute success and absolute failure, there's really no way to understand radicalism, especially in the United States, perhaps, other than to see a string of failures, because obviously the revolution that they looked for did not occur. But Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman didn't think in those terms. They always had the end goal, an extremely utopian goal in mind, but they didn't agitate all those years solely for the revolution, but were constantly working for better living conditions, better housing, better working conditions, better relationships between the genders. And in those causes, they and the labor movement more generally really transformed the way society existed. In terms of anarchist revolutions, I mean, the Spanish Civil War is one of the highlights. Zuccotti Square was a highlight of anarchist governance. But no, there's no permanent anarchist commonwealth yet.
What was the drug of choice for the anarchists?
The drug of choice.
Joy of choice. Yeah, alcohol, I would say. I probably there's some cocaine. I don't remember seeing that much written about that.
You've mentioned a little bit about anarchism and violence, and in my reading, I really thought that Berkman and Goldman had really kind of changed their view after the assassination attempt on Frick. Mm-hmm. Is that your feeling, or it seemed like that really changed their idea of what role violence could play in social change?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, and I'm kind of following the scholarship of Paul Avrich here, who's written a lot, about anarchism. It seems that Berkman was supportive of the conspiracy to bomb Rockefeller's mansion in 1914, that he was sort of a ringleader of it. I mean, he wasn't personally there when they were making the bomb and wasn't killed in the explosion, but he was supportive of doing that. So I think he continued to see kind of symbolic acts of violence as having some value. And I don't think, Goldman never entirely forswore violence, although I think she maybe was more cognizant of the damage that it could do to radicalism and to some of the alliances that she was actually working to build in the 1910s with liberals and, other kinds of labor and, so I think they were a little bit, there was a little bit of a difference between them, but I don't think they ever really forswore it, although they didn't come out and advocate it, quite in the same way. I mean, and it's a little bit surprising maybe after what happened with the attempted assassination, you would kind of think maybe they would give up on it, but I don't think they did entirely. But, that's really my reading from Avrich. I don't know, Ty, what you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in many ways, Alexander Berkman was in the United States for 30 years or so, and he spent almost 20 of that years of that time in prison. But when he wasn't in prison, he basically was responsible for every act of violence that occurred in the United States. So I think that he certainly was an advocate of violence, and I think that speaks to the fact that Emma was despite her reputation as being more of an actor than a thinker, I think she actually was a far more subtle thinker and theorist than she gets credit for. Whereas Berkman really never got beyond the very romanticized vision of the anarchist as a one-dimensional agent of complete social transformation. But I think you're right that Emma Goldman spent all those years organizing, while Berkman spent those years in jail, and so she had far more experience dealing with people than he ever did, and was far better at it.
So, getting back to it sort of touches on both violence and what she would have seen as success, but what would you say was Emma Goldman's theory of change? If you look at successful social movements, they have Martin Luther King said, we will use nonviolence to leverage public pressure against segregation in the South. Or the environmentalists in the 80s saying we will use laws passed in the 70s to win court cases to produce better environmental outcomes. What was Emma Goldman's strategy for making society more in the way that she wanted it to be?
That's a great question.
It is. For all of the anarchists, they had. I mean, the problem with anarchism and the beauty of anarchism is that everything you do has to be anarchistic in a sense. That if you over elaborate your plans, you've already kind of betrayed the essence of your vision. So, I mean, there's a term called prefigurative politics. I mean, in a sense, in a certain type of anarchist thinking, the politics and the movement that leads to social change has to mirror and mimic the society that will come afterwards. And so they had always known that the Marxist idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat would lead to just a more centralized and more violent form of capitalist production or of state production. The idea that you could then transition from this centralized repressive regime into a anarchist-style socialism, they never thought that would happen. Because in a very real way, the Marxist vision and the anarchist vision for post-capitalist society is very similar, and the difference is in the road to get there. For the anarchists, I'll just say one other thing, which is that they had an extremely high value on education, and some of the most important work that they did in New York was the founding of something called the Modern School, which was originally down here and then moved up to what's now East Harlem. And they really fostered an educational theory of pure student-centered learning. And I've been to the reunions of these students, and they all turned into sculptors and artists and engineers, but none of them ever learned how to read. I mean, they all, it was a very, it was a slightly problematic educational theory in the context of society at large. But the long-term vision was that you would raise a generation of people who had been raised without the pathologies of capitalism, and that was when you could instill these utopian visions.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, I mean, I think Goldman was really saw, in a way, the most essential thing that had to happen was a shift in consciousness, and that was her talks were kind of provocative and questioning, just to really try to get people to think. She believed if people really started to think about the world around them and the inequalities around them, that they would kind of want to make change after that, out of that. But I think, as Ty said, I mean, it's a utopian kind of ideology, so it's not necessarily so neatly mapped out exactly how it's going to happen.
I mean, it's kind of amazing on that point how she stuck with it for so long after, deportation and then the failed, her view of what she viewed as a failure of the Bolshevik Revolution and so on. She just kept with that belief, which is amazing.
Right. Yeah.
I have two questions related to the research, totally different, because I was also curious about the original materials. But one question I have is how you collected as the highest named people in the newspapers, and the other is what pieces of information are missing that you wish you could have or would add to the picture.
Well, the easy answer is the newspapers. That was derived from a online database of newspapers called ProQuest. So that reflected probably, I would say, dozens at most. But I mean, it's not a huge number of newspapers in that period. But I just sort of tracked it over the course of those years. In terms of the missing information, my research and book centers around that explosion in 1914, in which the three anarchists who were constructing this bomb were killed in the explosion, and so no one who survived knew exactly what they were doing, or if they knew, no one ever said exactly what they were doing. So the central part of my narrative is built around something that really can never be known. It's really not known what their plan was for that bomb, although there's plenty of speculation. I actually once met a woman actually at one of these reunions of anarchists, and she came up to me and she said, she was in her 80s, and came up to me and she said, my mother twisted the fabric that was the fuse on that bomb. And I thought, boy, she must have been a terrible bomb maker. I mean, it's not something to be proud of because it obviously didn't work.
And some people at the time Elizabeth Gurley Flynn thought the police had probably planted the bomb. So there were people that thought, it was planted to discredit the anarchists.
We'll do one more question.
Was it Emma Goldman's, was it her decision to be buried in the United States? And if so, why would she want to be buried in a place that had so rejected her?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I know that it may have been in her will, but it certainly speaks to her. I think both she and Berkman really identified with America and with New York in particular. And I think that they had extremely high hopes and frustrations with America, but although their story is global and anarchism is really a global story, it's also a really interesting American story and New York story as well.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry.
And I don't know either, but I was wondering, could it be that she would have selected Chicago perhaps because that was where her political awakening, or one of a big turning point.
It was the
Haymarket, right, for 18.
No matter what happened in America, it's in the book. She said, I feel America's my home. She says that when she's in the world.
Right, yeah. So if she could have, she would have come back to the United States after she saw kind of what a disaster Soviet Russia was. She wanted to come back, but she couldn't.
And one of the main points that Vivian Gornick makes in her book, too, is about how she is an American thinker. Like, the ideas of Thoreau were just as important as many of the other anarchist thinkers. We're going to wrap up, but I will end. First of all, I want to deeply thank Ty Jones and Lara Vapnek for their wonderful content. And I want to thank Eva Amesse, who was Emma Goldman.